Smoke was rising from a mountain where no one had ever built a chimney. The men who first saw it from the valley road stopped their wagon and stared. There was no cabin on that slope, no barn, no fence, no path worn into the grass. Just gray stone, a scatter of dead pine, and now, impossibly, a thin gray ribbon curling up into the evening sky. One of them said it had to be smoke from a brush fire, dying out on its own. The other one knew better. He had seen that kind of smoke before, thin and steady and patient, the kind that only comes from a fire someone is feeding on purpose. 3 weeks earlier, that same mountain had nothing on it at all. 3 weeks earlier, a woman had walked past that slope with everything she owned wrapped in a single blanket, and the people who watched her go were already certain of how her story would end. Not cruelly, not even unkindly, just certain. The way people get certain about a woman alone with no house, no husband, and no land, when the first hard frost is only weeks away. They were wrong about almost everything that followed. What she found in that mountain wasn't shelter in the way anyone expected. It wasn't a cabin hidden among the rocks, and it wasn't a lucky miracle waiting to be discovered. It was something stranger, something that made grown men stand in a doorway of stone months later, turning their hats over in their hands, unsure of what to say to a woman they had already decided was finished. This is the story of what she noticed on that slope, when everyone else had only ever seen a mountain not worth the trouble of looking at twice. If you are watching this on a cold night somewhere, tell us where you are in the comments. Stories like hers survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps keep them alive. Ruth Calloway was kneeling in the root cellar when she heard the wagon. She did not need to look up to know who it was. Only one man in the county drove a wagon with a wheel that clicked on every third turn. And only one man had a reason to come out to her farm 2 days after the first killing frost. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead for 14 months, long enough for the neighbors to stop bringing food. Long enough, apparently, for his younger brother to decide that grief had run its course, and business could begin. Silas Calloway did not get down from the wagon right away. He let the notary do that. A thin man with a leather folder who walked toward the porch like he was approaching something that might still bite. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and came out to meet them, because whatever this was, she was not going to receive it from inside a cellar. The debt, it turned out, had never belonged to Daniel at all. It belonged to Daniel and Silas together, a loan taken years before Ruth had ever set foot on the property, secured against the very land she was standing on. Daniel had always meant to pay his half. Daniel was no longer able to explain that to anyone. Silas was almost gentle about it. He said the word unfortunate 3 times. He said he had waited as long as he reasonably could. He said the bank in town had stopped being patient with him, which made Ruth wonder briefly who exactly was being asked to be patient with whom. What he did not say, but made clear enough, was the date. She had until the first heavy snow to be gone. In this part of the country, that could mean 3 weeks. It could mean 10 days. Ruth did not argue the debt. She had seen the paperwork once, years ago, folded into Daniel's coat pocket, and some tired part of her had already known this day existed somewhere ahead of her, waiting. What she asked for instead was time to gather what was hers. Silas glanced at the notary, as if the answer required consultation, then nodded once. He did not offer to help her carry anything. He did not offer a place for her to go. He simply turned the wagon around in the yard where she had once hung wash to dry, and left her standing in front of a house that would belong to someone else before the ground froze solid. That night, Ruth sat by a stove she would not own much longer and made a list of what a person could carry on foot for 2, perhaps 3 days. The list was shorter than she expected. Everything else, The furniture, the good china, the chair Daniel had built with his own hands the winter they married, would stay behind for a debt she had never signed her name to. She did not cry. She had done that already, months ago, for a different kind of loss. This one required something else from her, something colder and more practical, and she was already beginning to understand that she would need every ounce of it before the snow came. By the time Ruth left the farm, she had reduced her entire life to one wool blanket, tied at the corners and slung across her back like a pack. Inside it was a tin cup Daniel had carried through 2 winters of trapping before they married. A folding knife, a small sack of dried beans, a length of rope, and a Bible that had belonged to her mother. She had wanted to bring more. The blanket had made the decision for her. She walked the main road first, past the mill and the general store, where a few people she had known for years found sudden reasons to be somewhere else. Mrs. Aldous, who had once brought soup to the house when Daniel first fell ill, watched Ruth pass from behind her own window and did not come out. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the particular kind of silence a small town uses when it has already decided a story is over and does not know how to speak to someone still living inside it. One family did offer her a barn to sleep in for a single night, and she took it, grateful and ashamed in equal measure. The husband would not meet her eyes over breakfast the next morning. His wife pressed a small sack of cornmeal into her hands at the door and told her quietly that there was nothing more they could spare before their own winter arrived. Ruth understood. Charity in that country had limits, and those limits were measured in cords of firewood and pounds of stored grain, not in kindness. By the second day, the road had thinned to little more than a cart path, and the farms had thinned along with it. She was walking now through country that belonged to no one in particular, land too broken by ridges and stone to plow, the kind of ground men rode past on their way to somewhere better. She had heard of a mountain out this way once, years ago, in a conversation she had barely paid attention to at the time. Someone had called it worthless. Someone else had said there was nothing up there but rock and old stories nobody believed anymore. Ruth had no particular destination in mind when she left the farm. She only knew she could not stay near people who had already buried her in their minds. So when the first ridge of that mountain rose up ahead of her, gray and indifferent against a sky the color of wet ash, she did not turn away from it. She adjusted the blanket on her shoulders, felt the small, hard shape of the tin cup pressing against her spine, and kept walking toward the one piece of ground in the entire county that nobody else seemed to want. The mountain had a name once, though by the time Ruth reached its base, most people in the county had stopped using it and simply called it the Dead Ridge. It was easy to see why. The lower slopes were choked with broken stone, the kind that turned an ankle if you weren't careful, and what soil existed between the rocks was thin and sour, unfit for corn or wheat or anything a farmer might want to plant. A few stunted pines grew sideways out of the cracks, bent by decades of wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. No one grazed cattle here. No one had ever built so much as a line shack on its slopes, as far as Ruth knew. When she was younger, she remembered hearing an old trapper say the mountain simply did not want people on it, which had struck her at the time as foolish talk, the kind old men told to keep young ones away from places they themselves were too tired to explore. Standing at the base of it now, with the light beginning to fail and the temperature already dropping, Ruth found herself thinking less about superstition and more about the plain fact that nobody would come looking for her here. That, at least, was useful. A person with nowhere else to go could not afford to be picky about a mountain's reputation. She found a shallow overhang of rock for her first night, not quite a cave, more of a stone lip jutting out over a patch of dry ground. It kept the worst of the wind off her, though not the cold, and she spent the night with her knees pulled to her chest and the blanket wrapped twice around her shoulders, listening to a wind that never seemed to fully stop moving across the stone above her head. In the morning, stiff and hollow with hunger, she made a small fire from dead pine and boiled a handful of beans in the tin cup, one of the only true possessions she had left. She ate slowly, partly to make the food last, partly because moving quickly in the cold seemed to cost more than it was worth. It was while she sat there, waiting for the beans to soften, that she first noticed something strange about the mountain. Not the wind, which she had already grown used to. Something else. Something in how the light and the frost were behaving on the rock around her, in a way she could not immediately explain. She told herself it was nothing. Tired eyes saw strange things. But she kept looking anyway, because she had very little else to do that morning except watch a mountain that everyone else had decided was not worth watching at all. The frost, Ruth realized slowly, was not the same everywhere. Across most of the slope, the morning had left a pale gray coating on every rock, every branch, every blade of dead grass, the kind of even frost she had seen 100 mornings before on the farm. But a section of stone, perhaps 30 feet above her, tucked into a fold in the mountainside, where the wind seemed to bend around rather than through, had almost none. At first she thought it was simply a trick of the light, the sun striking that patch differently as it rose. But she watched it for the better part of an hour, moving closer between sips from the tin cup, and the pattern held. The frost avoided that section of rock the way water avoids high ground, as if something underneath was refusing to let the cold settle there the way it settled everywhere else. She pressed her bare palm against the stone once she reached it, half expecting to feel nothing at all. What she felt instead was faint, almost embarrassing to admit to herself. Not warmth exactly. Certainly nothing like a stove or a hearth, but something that was not quite as cold as the rock beside it. A difference so small she might have imagined it if her hand had not already grown accustomed to the bitter chill of everything else she had touched that morning. Ruth had spent enough winters on a working farm to know that small differences mattered more than people liked to admit. A field that drained a little better than its neighbor survived a wet spring. A wall that faced south instead of north kept its paint longer. She had never had reason to think about stone in the same way, but standing there with her palm still pressed against that strange patch of mountainside, she found herself wondering what else this slope might be doing that no one had ever bothered to notice. She followed the frost line further along the fold in the rock, and that was when she saw it, not the warm patch itself, but something behind it, a shadow that did not match the shape of the stone around it, a darkness that went back further than a mountain's surface had any reason to go. Ruth stood very still for a moment, the tin cup forgotten in her other hand, and told herself that a woman alone on an empty mountain should be careful about what she decided to believe she was looking at. Then she stepped closer to find out anyway. The shadow behind the frost line was not a trick of the light. It was an opening, narrow enough that Ruth had to turn sideways to fit through it, hidden behind a fold of stone that made it invisible from anywhere but the exact angle where she was standing. She hesitated at the threshold longer than she wanted to admit. A grown woman alone, stepping into a hole in a mountain that local trappers avoided, was not a decision she would have made a month earlier. But a month earlier, she had also owned a house, and that comparison settled the matter faster than courage ever could have. Inside, the air changed almost immediately. Not warm, not by any measure she would have called comfortable, but different from the biting wind outside in a way her whole body noticed before her mind had finished processing it. The wind itself simply stopped, as though the mountain had swallowed it whole the moment she crossed the threshold. The passage opened after a few steps into a chamber roughly the size of the front room she had left behind on the farm. Tall enough in the center for her to stand without stooping, narrowing toward the back into darker space she could not yet see the end of. The walls were dry. That surprised her most of all. She had expected the damp, dripping cold of every cave story she had ever heard as a child, and instead found stone that felt merely cool beneath her palm. Not wet, not sweating with moisture the way she had braced herself for. She lit a small bundle of dry pine needles she had carried in with her and held it up. The light caught pale streaks running through the rock overhead, and somewhere deeper in the chamber, she heard the faint, steady drip of water, though not near enough to reach where she stood. Whatever else this place was, it was not simply a hole exposed to every element outside. Something about its shape, its depth, the way it curved back into the mountainside rather than opening straight through, seemed to be holding the world outside at arm's length. Ruth sat down on the dry stone floor and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 days, to simply breathe without immediately calculating what came next. It would not be enough on its own. She understood that even in that first quiet moment. A cave was not a home, however dry, however sheltered from wind. There was no fire pit, no way yet to know if smoke would even find its way back out, no certainty that whatever kept the frost away from that outer wall would do anything at all once true winter arrived. But it was more than she had possessed an hour earlier, and after the week she had endured, that alone felt like something worth sitting with a little longer before deciding what to do next. She heard the dog before she heard the man. It came bounding through the rocks below the opening 2 mornings later, a rangy, gray-muzzled animal that stopped short at the sight of her and began barking in a way that was more announcement than threat. Its owner appeared a moment after, an older man with a rifle slung loosely over one shoulder and the weathered, sun-cracked look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. His name was Amos Whitfield, and he had trapped this stretch of country for close to 30 years. He did not seem frightened of her, exactly, but he did seem thoroughly confused, standing at the mouth of a cave he had apparently known about for decades and never once considered a place a person might choose to live. Ruth told him plainly what had happened. Amos listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying what she suspected he had been thinking the entire time. This was not, in his professional opinion, a wise place for a woman alone to spend a winter. His reasons were not foolish ones. He had seen bear sign further up the same ridge as recently as that autumn. The air in the deeper part of a cave like this could turn foul if a fire wasn't managed carefully, and a person could grow sick or worse without ever understanding why. And there was the matter of what people in town would say, which Amos raised carefully, aware it was the least practical of his objections, but unwilling to leave it unspoken. Ruth did not argue with any of it directly. Instead, she asked him to place his hand against the section of wall near the entrance, the same spot where the frost had refused to settle 2 mornings before. Amos did, more out of politeness than curiosity, and his expression changed slightly when he felt what she had felt. He had trapped this mountain for 30 years and had never once touched that wall in winter. He admitted as much, turning to look at the stone with something closer to attention than he had shown it before. Ruth did not have an explanation for what they were both feeling. She only had a stubborn certainty that a mountain capable of keeping frost off one section of rock in the coldest part of the morning, without any fire nearby to explain it, was a mountain worth paying closer attention to before deciding it was too dangerous to trust. Amos left that afternoon unconvinced, but he did not try to stop her. And before he disappeared back down the ridge, he told her he would check on her again in a week. Ruth chose to hear that as something closer to hope than warning. Ruth spent the following days doing the only kind of work available to a woman with no tools beyond a folding knife, a length of rope, and whatever the mountain itself was willing to provide. The entrance was her first concern. The narrow gap that let her slip inside also let in every gust of wind that found the ridge, and a fire close to that opening would do her little good if half its heat simply blew back out into the evening air. She gathered flat stones from the slope below, dragging them up one at a time, and began stacking them into a low wall across most of the opening, leaving a gap barely wide enough for her body, and a smaller one near the top. She left uncovered on purpose. She could not have explained, in that moment, exactly why the smaller gap felt necessary. It simply seemed wrong to seal the chamber completely, the way it would feel wrong to shut every window in a house at once, even in winter. Something in her understood, without yet having words for it, that air needed somewhere to go. Inside, she cleared a space near the entrance for a fire, ringing it with more of the flat stones she had carried up from below. She packed dry moss and pine needles into the gaps of her new stone wall, layer after layer, until the worst of the drafts along the floor had quieted. She dragged in what dead wood she could find on the lower slopes, more than she thought she would need. Then went back for more anyway, because she had learned enough from her years on the farm never to trust her own optimism about how much fuel a winter actually required. By the fourth day, the chamber had begun to resemble something closer to a shelter than a hole in a mountainside. It was not comfortable. The floor was hard, the walls unforgiving, and the silence at night pressed in on her in a way the farmhouse never had. But it was dry, and it was out of the wind, and for the first time since Silas Calloway's wagon had rolled into her yard, Ruth allowed herself to believe she might actually make it through to spring. That night, she built her first real fire inside the chamber, larger than the small test flames she had risked before, and settled back to watch it catch. She did not yet know that the very thing she had built to save her was about to show her, within hours, exactly how much she still did not understand about the mountain she had chosen. The smoke came back on her within the hour. At first it was only a faint sting in her eyes, easy enough to dismiss as the ordinary bite of wood smoke in a small space. But it did not clear the way smoke should clear from a room with an opening to the outside. Instead, it gathered near the ceiling of the chamber, thickening, curling back down toward her in slow, deliberate layers, until breathing became something she had to think about, rather than something her body simply did on its own. Ruth backed away from the fire, coughing, her eyes streaming, and pressed herself toward the small gap she had left uncovered near the top of her stone wall. The air there was marginally better, but only marginally, and as she crouched low near the floor where the smoke had not yet settled, she understood with a cold, sinking clarity that something about her design was wrong. She had assumed, without ever fully examining the assumption, that smoke would simply find its own way out, the way it always had at the farmhouse, rising up through a proper chimney built for exactly that purpose. But this was not a chimney. This was a chamber inside solid rock, with a single narrow passage leading out, and nothing about its shape seemed to be cooperating with the fire the way she needed it to. She let the fire burn down to embers rather than risk building it any higher, and spent the rest of that night huddled near the small gap in her wall, wrapped in her blanket, breathing air that was thin and stinging, and nowhere near as safe as she had convinced herself it would be only hours before. By morning, her chest ached, and her voice had gone rough from coughing, and for the first time since she had found the opening in the rock, Ruth allowed herself to seriously consider that Amos Whitfield might have been right after all. A cave was not a house. Whatever advantage that strange, frost-free patch of stone had offered her, it clearly was not enough to solve a problem this basic, this immediate, this capable of doing real harm if she got it wrong a second time. She sat at the mouth of the cave that morning, watching pale smoke drift out through the gap she had left in her wall, and forced herself to actually look at it rather than simply feel defeated by it. The smoke was moving. Slowly, unevenly, but moving, finding its way towards that one small opening as though something about the shape of the chamber itself was pulling it there. It was not going out fast enough. Not yet, but it was going somewhere on its own, without her forcing it, and Ruth had spent enough winters solving smaller problems on a working farm to recognize the shape of an answer that was almost, but not quite yet, complete. Amos Whitfield returned 4 days later, exactly as he had promised, and found Ruth sitting at the mouth of the cave, with a voice still rough from smoke and eyes that had not fully stopped watering. He did not say he had told her so. She gave him credit for that, later, when she had time to think about it. Instead, he asked to see the fire, and she showed him, embarrassed, the low stone ring and the narrow gap near the top of her wall that was clearly not doing its job. Amos crouched at the entrance for a long while, saying nothing, running his hand along the inside of the stone wall the way a man reads the weather off a sky he does not entirely trust. Then he said something Ruth had not expected. He had seen a chamber shaped something like this before, years earlier, on a hunting trip far to the west, where a band of Ute families kept a winter camp built into rock much like this one. Their fire had never sat where his eye first wanted to place it. It sat off to one side, away from the opening, with a second, smaller gap positioned not above the fire, but above the empty space beside it. He could not explain the reasoning the way a schoolteacher might, but he had watched it work well enough to remember it 3 decades later. The smoke, he said, did not want to be pushed. It wanted to be given somewhere obvious to go, and it wanted that somewhere to sit apart from the fire itself, not directly above the flames where the rising heat and the tangled air only fought each other in the confined space of a cave roof. Ruth spent the rest of that day testing the idea in the only way available to her, through trial. She moved the fire ring to one side of the chamber, away from the small vent overhead, and used a flat piece of stone propped at an angle to guide the rising heat toward the opening, rather than letting it climb straight up and stall against the low ceiling. The first fire she built under the new arrangement still produced smoke, of course. Fire always did, but instead of pooling and thickening near the roof, it moved, steadily, unmistakably, drawn toward the gap Amos had helped her recognize the purpose of, spilling out into the evening air in a thin, continuous ribbon, instead of gathering above her head like a held breath. She sat beside that fire long after dark, watching the smoke leave the mountain instead of filling it, and understood for the first time that she had not simply been living in a cave. She had been living inside a structure that behaved according to rules older than her own trial and error, rules that other people, in other places, had learned long before her and had no way of passing down except by chance, by memory, by a trapper who happened to remember what he had seen 30 years before, and happened to think it worth mentioning to a woman who was still, stubbornly, willing to listen. The first real test came without warning, the way early winter storms in that country usually did. Ruth woke to a sky the color of old iron, and a wind that had shifted overnight from its usual restless wandering into something with clear intention. By mid-morning, snow was falling steadily, not yet the blinding kind that buried roads and froze cattle where they stood, but enough to coat the ridge in white within a few hours, and enough to tell her that the season had finally decided to stop threatening and start arriving. She built her fire in its new position, off to the side, beneath the vent Amos had helped her understand, and settled in to watch what the mountain would do with a storm instead of simply an ordinary cold morning. The smoke behaved. That alone felt like a small miracle after the coughing, sleepless nights of the week before. It rose, gathered near the angled stone she had propped to guide it, and slipped out through the narrow gap in a thin gray thread that the wind outside tore apart almost as quickly as it appeared. Inside, the air stayed breathable, faintly smoky, but nothing close to the choking haze of that first failed night. By afternoon, word of the woman living in the dead ridge had apparently reached further than Ruth realized. She heard voices outside before she saw anyone, and stepped to the entrance to find a boy of perhaps 12 standing a cautious distance away. Sent, he explained, by his mother to see if the stories were true. He did not stay long. He looked past Ruth into the chamber, at the low fire and the stone walls, and the thin ribbon of smoke sliding out into the storm above his head, and something in his expression shifted from curiosity toward a kind of reluctant respect. He was clearly too young to fully hide. He left before dark, promising to tell his mother what he had seen. And Ruth understood, watching him go, that whatever privacy she had enjoyed on this mountain was likely coming to an end. The storm passed by the following morning, leaving perhaps 6 inches of new snow across the ridge, and a silence so complete it felt almost unfamiliar after the wind of the night before. Ruth stepped outside to find her small fire still smoldering, her supply of wood still holding, and her own chest, for the first time in this entire ordeal, entirely clear of the ache smoke had left there before. It was not the real test. She knew that. This had been a small storm, an early one, nothing close to the deep winter still waiting somewhere ahead of her. But it was proof of something. And after the week she had endured, Ruth found she was willing to let a small proof carry her forward, one uncertain day at a time, toward whatever came next. The real storm arrived 11 days later, and it did not announce itself gently the way the first one had. The wind changed direction sometime after midnight, swinging around from its usual path and slamming instead against the exact side of the ridge where Ruth's careful vent was cut. She woke to a sound she had not heard before, a low, hollow moan moving through the stone above her, and within minutes understood the reason for it. Smoke that had behaved perfectly for 11 straight nights was suddenly refusing to leave at all, pressed back down into the chamber by wind now blowing directly into the opening she had built to let it out. She smothered the fire fast, before the smoke could thicken past what the small chamber could clear, and sat in near total darkness, listening to a storm that sounded from inside solid rock, like something enormous trying to find a way in. For a long while, there was nothing to do but wait and think. Ruth considered blocking the vent entirely, sealing herself into silence and stillness until the wind passed. But some instinct from her weeks of trial and failure told her that a chamber sealed completely, with no fire and no air moving at all, carried its own risks in cold this severe. She considered instead moving the fire itself, dragging her stones to the opposite side of the chamber, away from the wind's new direction, though doing so blind, in the dark, with a storm this loud outside, felt like exactly the kind of decision that got people hurt. In the end, she did something smaller and more patient. She built the smallest fire she dared, barely more than embers, positioned close against the wall furthest from the wind's new path, and packed loose stone and moss into one half of her vent, narrowing rather than sealing it, leaving just enough gap for the thinnest possible draw. The smoke that gathered that night was thicker than she wanted, sharper in her throat than any night since the failure 2 weeks before. But it did not fill the chamber the way it had that first time. It hung, uncomfortable and stinging, in a layer well above where she sat huddled against the wall, thin enough at floor level for her to keep breathing, thick enough overhead that she did not dare stand. She stayed like that through the worst of it, crouched low, feeding the smallest possible fire just enough fuel to keep from freezing outright, listening to wind that seemed determined to find every flaw in a shelter she had built with her own hands out of nothing but stone and stubbornness. Morning came slowly, the way it always did after a night like that, more felt than seen. When Ruth finally allowed herself to believe the worst of the wind had passed, she pushed aside enough of the packed stone to look outside into a world gone entirely white and silent, and understood that whatever she had built on that mountain had, somehow, held. By the time true spring reached the dead ridge, Ruth Calloway was no longer a story people in town told with pity. Amos Whitfield had spread word of her through the winter, not out of gossip, but out of a trapper's plain habit of reporting what he had seen, and what he had seen, more than once, was a woman surviving conditions that had driven better supplied homesteads further down the valley to abandon their own claims and move into town for the season. A few families, once they understood she had not simply endured the winter, but had built something that worked, began asking careful questions about the mountain nobody had wanted before. Ruth answered them plainly, without pride and without apology. She showed the boy's mother, when she finally came herself, exactly where the vent needed to sit apart from the fire, and why. She never claimed to have invented anything. She said only that she had noticed something the mountain was already doing, made one mistake in understanding it, and been fortunate enough to have an old trapper remember something useful at exactly the right moment. Silas Calloway never came to see the shelter himself, as far as anyone in town ever reported, though word reached Ruth eventually that he had mentioned her, once, at the same bank that had pressured him into evicting her in the first place, in a tone that was no longer quite as certain as it had been the day his wagon rolled into her old yard. Ruth did not return to that farm, even after the debt against it was long settled by other means. She stayed on the ridge through a second winter, and a third, and by then 2 other families in the county had built smaller versions of her stone-vented chamber into hillsides of their own, none of them exactly like hers, each shaped by whatever their own particular ground happened to offer. She kept Daniel's tin cup on a shelf of stone near her fire for the rest of her life on that mountain, and told anyone who asked that it had never once left her side, not on the road out of her old home, not through that first coughing, failed night, not through the long blizzard that had nearly convinced her the whole plan was a mistake. What people in the valley remembered, years later, was not really the cave at all. It was the fact that a mountain everyone had agreed was worthless had been quietly waiting the entire time for someone patient enough to ask it the right question. The wall she built was never beautiful. It was never meant to be. It simply gave the wind fewer places to enter, and gave her, one difficult winter at a time, a place to belong again. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is a plausible reconstruction inspired by frontier building practices and traditional shelter techniques recorded from various cultures across North America. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.